Yes, I don't know if it's so much, I don't think I'm in the chapter on real Canadian pirates so much as Gertie is, and I kind of got to be in there too. For those of you who may remember Gun Powder Gertie, Pirate Queen of the Kootenays, she got a whole chapter in this book, Real Canadian Pirates. She just goes and does things all by herself now. It's really cool. So, let's get down to the story, because that's what it's all about. Are you ready, honey? All right. When people go to visit the ghost town of Sandon today, some people might come away thinking it wasn't such a big deal. I mean, you drive into this steep and narrow valley with thickly forested hills rising up on either side. Carpenter Creek rushes down the center of the valley, and close beside it are the remains of the old town. A handful of old buildings and a couple of sadly unfinished replicas of the originals that once stood beside them. And it might not seem like much to conjure up an image of the up-and-coming town that did once fill the valley. The time was when Sandon was one of the largest and fastest-growing cities in Western Canada. But back in 1898, there were 29 hotels and more saloons. They had the first hydroelectric power station in Western Canada that provided electricity for the entire town. They had one of the first telephone systems in the interior. They had a state-of-the-art hospital, a ski hill, a recreation complex with a large covered ice rink on the roof of which you could do lawn bowling, tennis, and cricket in the summertime. They had 2 train stations, they had factories, breweries, they had all kinds of things. They had newspapers, churches, theaters, opera houses, a thriving red light district, and more mines than you could shake a stick at. When night fell on the sunless city, you could cast your eyes up and see the lights of the town twinkling up the hillside, both sides, right up into the alpine there. Like most boom towns, Sandon seemed to rise up almost overnight. One week there was a bunch of tents pitched in the forest in the bottom of the valley. The next there was a town. Now there were never enough beds to go around, it seemed, for all the fortune seekers coming, so it wasn't unusual for some places, hotels, to rent out their beds in shifts. So the next man coming in would be getting into a bed with sheets still warm from the fellow who just gotten out of it. And what did they use to build this gem of the West? Well, same thing as they used to build every other town in Western Canada, wood. Gosh knows there was plenty of it. I mean, you couldn't even build anything till you cut down the trees and cleared out a building site. And brick and stone were very hard to come by, so it only made sense to use what there was plenty of right at hand. Oh, you have to forgive me, I'm not feeling very well today. My fever only broke on Wednesday. Wood was needed for almost everything. I mean, they needed timbers to hold up the miles of mining towns that surrounded that tunneled through the surrounding mountainsides. Railroad ties were needed for laying the tracks of the incoming CPR and KNS railroads. Planks were needed to build the sidewalks that lined almost every town in Sandon. Wood was even used to build water pipelines, culverts, and the large wooden flume that directed Carpenter Creek right under the main street of Sandon. And of course, lumber was needed to build all those buildings. And all those buildings needed to be heated. Because winter in Sandon was no joke. It could get terribly cold. And 15 feet in the winter of snow wasn't unusual at all. So there was an endless need for firewood. Now, Eugene Paley Peterson and his family moved to Sandon in 1922, and he was 6 years old. Now, Sandon, by that time, his fortunes had taken a bit of a downturn, and the building boom was in a bit of a slump. But there were still 1,500 people, 4 general stores, 5 hotels, the hospital, power station, post office, an ice cream store, and people still needed firewood. And Paley's family was no different. They lived in a shack on Huckleberry Lane, high up the hillside. A row of shanties perched high on stilts, with nothing resembling insulation in the walls. In winter, spilled water would freeze on the floor before it could be wiped up. And sometimes they had to take the vegetables to bed with them to make sure they wouldn't freeze overnight. So keeping the fire burning in the wood stove wasn't just important, It was a necessity. Well, Pele's father was dead, and his mother still had 4 children at home to raise, so there wasn't any money to pay anyone to cut firewood for the family. All the children pitched in, gathering wood from anywhere they could find it, till there wasn't a twig nor a stick to be found anywhere in the neighborhood. As Pele and his brother Schnoos, so called for the schnooze or chewing tobacco he fetched for off-duty miners, running errands for them, grew older, they'd go and scrounge firewood from anywhere they could, using borrowed tools and eventually learning to cut down trees as well as most any longer. And like most people, it only seemed to make sense to cut the wood up the hill from where they lived, as close by as possible, to make it easier to haul home. So, where we look up the hillside and see large trees and a mature forest around Sandon, in Pele's day, he had a very different view. When he looked up, it was to see largely bare hillsides above the town. Everywhere that is, except for a 600-wide-foot strip of trees above the Ruth Hope mine. Now, so many people had been cutting firewood right above the town site that avalanches had become a real problem. Sometimes they'd come thundering down right into town. Now, Johnny Harris, who owned the Ruth Hope, he understood the stabilizing effect that trees had on the deep snowpack, and so he had decreed a strict taboo against anyone cutting firewood above his holdings. It was from the top of this strip of trees, about a half-mile above the town site, that Pele and Schnoos were rustling their firewood. Now, dropping trees on those steep slopes was a serious business. There was any number of things that could go wrong. I mean, the tree could settle back on your saw, trapping it. Or all kinds of things. The hinge could let go too soon. It could kick back when it was coming down. While you were making your cut, dead branches, called widowmakers, could fall silently down with deadly results. Or the tree might get hung up on its way down and refuse to fall at all. And while you were watching out for all these things that could go wrong, well, you had to be careful to make sure that you sent the tree just so that it fell across the face of the hill, so the still standing trees would hold it in place. If you didn't get your undercut just right, well, it might fall down the hill, and then you could have what you called a runaway. Now, Pele and Schnoos had heard all the stories of trees that had gotten away and run down the hill, wreaking havoc and destruction in their path. Like the tale the old-timers told of a tree that got away over on Sunnyside Hill. Seems the husband and wife had put in an order for firewood. They just didn't expect the manner of its arrival. There they were, eating breakfast one morning in the kitchen, when all of a sudden a great huge tree came smashing through the kitchen wall. It crashed through the floor, sending husband, wife, table, and debris everywhere before finally plowing to a stop in the dirt of the basement. The terrified couple was lucky to get away with nothing more than bumps and bruises, but that wasn't going to happen to Pele and Schnoos. No, sir. They were going to be careful. Pele had it all planned out, just where his undercut was going to go, just so the tree would fall across the face of the hill, right where he planned for it to go. The boys completed the back cut, carefully watching in case anything went wrong. The tree groaned and shuddered and began to fall, right where Pele had planned for it to go. And the boys breathed a sigh of relief. Then it happened. The boys had failed to notice one tree just uphill of their falling tree's path that had a branch sticking out at right angles, 90 degrees, right into the trajectory of their falling tree. Helplessly, they watched in slack-jawed horror as their tree hit that branch, slowed, and then started to slide. It slid along the length of that branch, off the end, gently pivoted 90 degrees, and slammed to the earth, pointed right down the hill. It bounced once, and then shot off through the trees, faster than a greased pig. There was a great crashing, a distant yell, and then silence. Haley leaped up on the stump and stared down the hill, peering through the trees, but it was gone. The boys stared in disbelief down the hill. Haley looked at Schnooss. Schnooss looked at Haley. They looked down the hill again. How far could it have gone? The noise hadn't gone on that long. Surely it couldn't have gone too far. There was only one way to find out. The boys set off down the hill in pursuit of that runaway tree. Well, Haley and Schnooss reached the bottom of the strip of trees without finding any sign of their runaway. They stood just inside the tree line, out of sight, peering at the path that their runaway must have taken. Well, their home on Huckleberry Lane, was down the hill from where they'd made their cut, but over to the side enough to be safely out of harm's way. There were, however, several other obstacles directly in the path of their runaway, the first of which was the Sandon Waterworks flume. The large wooden pipeline that took water to the hydroelectric power station that provided the entire town with its electricity. Braced for the worst, the boys headed down the hill towards where the flume ran across the hillside. Well, luckily, the flume was still intact. The boys looked up and they could see where the tree had come hurtling down the hill, gouging a great scrape across the top of the flume as it sailed right over the top of it, throwing behind a scattering of twigs and branches that were being sucked along in its wake. But their tree had not stopped there. The next thing in the tree's path was the road to the wonderful mine. Dirty and disheveled, the boys continued down the hill. When they arrived, they looked around hopefully. There was no one on the road, just a great divot in the far edge of the road bank that looked like it had been made by a cannonball. They looked up and they could see where the tree had come careening off the high side of the cut bank on the road, plunged into the dirt at the edge of the road bank, and then, being pretty springy for a dead tree, it had bent like a giant bow and then launched itself skyward, like a great caber tossed at the Highland Games. And that's when it had become airborne. And it was headed straight for the power lines that supplied the Silversmith mine. With sinking hearts, the boys continued down the hill. Well, that tree must have been traveling at an altitude of approximately 20 feet when it sailed right through those power lines, snapping them like so many thin threads. Luckily for the boys, the Silversmith mine was not in active operation at the moment, and so the power was not running in the lines, and they didn't have to worry about being electrocuted as they made their way under the dangling ends. Of their runaway, there was no sign. There was one obstacle left between them and the town, and that was the railroad tracks of the CPR. And that's where they found their tree. Haley and Schnooss crouched hidden in the underbrush above the tracks, looking at their runaway tree. It stood on a crazy angle, still shuddering like a giant javelin just come to earth. The tree had been gradually losing altitude after trashing the power lines, and it arced back down to earth, coming to rest smack between the tracks and burying one end deep into the dirt of the roadbed. Now, the CPR didn't take kindly to trespassers at the best of times, much less somebody driving a 100-foot hemlock deep into the dirt of their roadbed. The boys looked up the tracks. The boys looked down the tracks. No one was in sight. The boys looked at each other. And in unspoken agreement, they carefully drew further back into the concealing underbrush and then made their way home, quietly, via the back roads. And for a whole day, they thought they might have gotten away with it. Then on the way home from school, Haley and Schnooss ran into Frank Urich, the CPR section foreman. And Frank greeted the boys cheerfully enough and informed them, with a twinkle in his eye, that their tree had been cut up into cordwood lengths and stacked beside the tracks, where they could pick it up at their leisure. Well, the unfortunate thing was that that stack of wood, lovely as it was now far below their home, high up the hillside on Huckleberry Lane. And with no money to pay anyone to haul it up the hill to their house, it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did our boys. So in the end, they gave the wood to one Otto Bjorehouse, an aged shopkeeper who was mighty glad of the gift and lived close by. So at least somebody got some good out of the whole escapade. Pele found out later that Frank and his crew had actually tried to dig out the tree from where it had replanted itself in the roadbed, but gave up when they had dug down over 3 feet and eventually sawed it off at ground level. The sawed-off stump was right on the route that Pele and Schnooz had to walk to school, so every day they had to face that embarrassing reminder of the tree that got away. And that was the very last time that Pele and Schnooz went rustling firewood from Johnny Harris's claims. Well, at least until the next time the wood piled ran low. Thank you very much.